Hey guys, you're listening to episode 136 of the Finish Line podcast, where we discuss the intersection of faith, generosity, and personal finance. My name is Keelan, and I'm here with my co-host and brother Cody. Today we're talking to Mary Helen Klingen, financial advisor with Blue Trust. Mary Helen began her path in accounting, but found her way into financial advising, where she's able to walk beside clients on a regular basis to encourage them to deeper generosity. Mary Helen also has a particular interest for empowering single women in integrating their faith and finances, and has been very active in the robust stewardship ministry at her church. She was full of practical advice, and you won't want to miss all she had to share. You know, this podcast has grown almost exclusively by word of mouth. For those of you who have helped get the message out there by sending a link to a friend or sharing on social media, we just want to say thanks. It really makes an impact. If you think this or any of our other conversations are thought-provoking or inspiring, take a moment to share it with someone. We have been blown away at how God has used some of these stories to make a radical impact in the world of generosity and missions. And you can be a link in that chain. All right, let's get to the interview. All right, we are fortunate enough to have Julie Wilson from Women Doing Well co-hosting with us again. Thanks again for being with us, Julie.
Always great to be here.
And we are very privileged to have Mary Helen Klingen with us. Mary Helen, thanks so much for being with us and taking a little bit of your time to share your story with us today.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Excited for this conversation.
So why don't you kick us off just telling us a little bit about yourself, maybe some of your early years and some of your faith background?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently I live in Houston, Texas, and I am born and raised Houstonian. I was really fortunate growing up that church and faith was something that my parents valued. So they took us to church every Sunday and put us in Christian private school and things like that. So I came to know about the Lord, about the Bible and things like that from a young age, was always very interested in those things. But really for me, when I was in middle school, I went to our church's youth camp, and that's really when faith in the Lord and a personal relationship really came alive for me. So it's something, as I've navigated into adulthood and into my career, I really believe in church youth groups and youth ministries. I saw a statistic recently that it's like the majority of people come to know the Lord before the age of 30. And so ministries to teenagers and 20-somethings. And so I definitely am in that statistic. So from 13 years old, really wanted to grasp on to following the Lord. I'm a person that I kind of go all in. I don't really know how to do things half-hearted. So I was really just blessed throughout middle school and high school just to be discipled really well in this ministry, to have mentors, church staff, just teach me a lot about God's word. And went to a Christian college for those years. And that was really the first time that I realized that my career and my faith could intersect, because I had really up till that point only seen it kind of diverge. If those are two different spaces, there is your work and there is your faith. And so I didn't really know what to do with that. I was an accounting major, so my plan was, to go to the Big Four and be a partner and things like that. But really kind of the through line of faith has been something since I was a kid, which I'm just really grateful for. Sometimes I feel like my story should be a lot wilder, and have definitely had my ups and downs and gone through things, but I'm just really thankful that God intersected my story from a young age. And then as I've navigated now into the adult years and career years, just to see a lot of that not come back together as in it fell apart, but come together in unique ways with my career and kind of how God's using that in my life.
Yeah, Mary Helen, I think that's a topic that many people can relate to, of this integration of faith and work. And I really do think that without intentionally trying to integrate them, they really can feel like they're supposed to be separate. And there's walls that are built up that are really maybe more perceived, but there's a reality to that. I'd love to hear how you were able to start to pursue that as you also were building a career in accounting.
Yeah. So when I went to college, I actually technically walked out. I always forget this, but I technically walked out with an accounting degree and a degree in French. And the reason was when I was in middle school, I had a dream that I wanted to become fluent in French. I just thought it was a really pretty language. And my dad said, that's fine if you want to go major in French, but you have to major in something else also. And my sophomore year of college, I spent a semester abroad in France, kind of doing, I guess, what I call like undercover missions. I was there as an exchange student, but went with a friend of mine, and we got to have a lot of really neat gospel conversations. And I always say I was waiting for God to call me into long-term missions, and that phone never rang. And he just made it really clear that that was the season, and I got to learn a lot. My heart really got to grow for the people in France and Western Europe. It's a very wealthy place with a lot of wealth, but spiritually is really poor and very dark. So I've got to learn just a lot about ministry in a country like that. And so I came back to the US and focused on my accounting major, and I was so frustrated at the Lord. I was like, what in the world is a CPA in the United States of America doing the American dream? How in the world can that be what you have for me? But it was just so clear. So I just remember kind of in those years and then after college, just kind of going, okay, I'm doing this, but I don't understand how God's going to use this. Going to a Christian college, if you major in accounting or business or anything like that, basically anything that's not ministry or missions, people are like, ugh, do you really love Jesus? Like, ugh. And so you're just kind of walking around and you're like, I promise I do, but I am going to go get my CPA license, which is just a funny thing if you go to like a big state school. That's just not a conversation that people have. So I got my master's in accounting, got my CPA license, got my fancy job at the Big Four, and thought I was off to the races. And just through some pivots out of the Big Four into corporate accounting, I started to realize that even though I loved numbers and analysis and things like that, long-term, the accounting profession just didn't really fit my skill set. God bless CPAs. I'm glad we have them. If you're listening to CPA, you are very valuable, and I'm so thankful for what you do, but I am just not a CPA. I don't want to be in a cubicle all day long. I want to be interacting and talking to people and doing different things. So I went on this journey when I was 25 of what do I want to do with my life in a season where a lot of people were just doing the job that they had right out of school. And they were just sort of like, well, it's working, and I'm, working at Exxon as an engineer. So, okay. And I'm having this like quarter life crisis of, what am I going to do with my life? And it proved to be one of the most beneficial journeys I've ever been on. It's funny. I look back now and it just feels so silly that I thought it was this big, crazy life thing, but it felt like my entire world was falling apart because I was like, God, you've called me to be this CPA, and then now you're calling me out of it. So what does this look like? But I like numbers. I like business. And so I literally was searching for what can you do with 2 degrees and a license to practice accounting that is not accounting. And what kept coming up was financial planning and financial advising. There's a huge push in the AICPA. And even I've heard the CPA exam is going to have financial planning on it now. So it kept coming up. So, was on this journey, listened to a ton of podcasts, read a ton of books, and finally got to the point where I, felt like this is my next step. This is a good use of my skills, abilities, background, all of these things. And I wasn't really looking to integrate my faith. Again, I had just been walking with the Lord, growing my faith, but wasn't really thinking, okay, how can I make my faith my career other than maybe I'll have intentional conversations with my coworkers about the Lord or witness through my actions, which are all wonderful, wonderful things, but wasn't thinking anything intentional. And went to the CFP board, and they had a job board on their website. And the first job that I found was Blue Trust. And I can remember the day of the moment I found it. And, it's a normal, I started as in kind of a paraplanner, financial planner role. And, everything they had on there was a normal, creates reports, meeting deliverables, all of those things. But there were 2 bullet points. There was one that said, commits to memorize scripture and about what the Bible says about money, and then commits to continue to do that and grow. And I was like, what is this place? Are they selling snake oil? Is this health, wealth, prosperity? What's going on here? And just through a family friend, just got connected with them. And really, it's just been an incredible journey to be on the team. I've been at Blue Trust for about 6 years now. And to see how God had planted that analytical, technical side of me, and then combining that with the biblical wisdom, because really the role of an advisor is a counselor. Yeah, they're going to come and get tax advice and investment advice, and all of those things are very important. And we, as believers, I really believe that we should be really good at those things. We should not use our Christianity as an excuse to, be subpar in any of those technical aspects. But then on the biblical side, you're sitting across from a client and they're telling you their fears about life, about, God providing, about their money, which is so connected to their heart. So it's just been this aha moment for me from the moment I stepped in the door of, okay, you gave me this business CPA background, and then you've intersected me now with Blue Trust at this point in my career to start to use my faith to counsel clients. And I always kind of use the analogy of my career is a little bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Public accounting was too big, too fast. Corporate accounting was too small, too slow. And then financial planning has kind of been that right fit. And then to have that overlay of my faith has just been kind of the sweet spot of how God wrote my story. So it's been really fun.
Yeah, we've had a number of Blue Trust advisors on the podcast over the years, because there is a really high density of strong believers who are really intentional with their faith in the context of finances at Blue Trust. And I'd love to hear your perspective coming into Blue Trust and into financial advising as a whole career. What was unique about the culture, the environment, the priorities of Blue Trust that really set a foundation for integrating faith and finance as God was kind of leading you up through to that point?
I think there's two things that I noticed off the bat about Blue Trust. Number one, they are serious about their mission. They do not take it lightly. And their mission is to help Christians free up resources to fulfill the Great Commission. So I love the end result is the Great Commission, which as believers, we're all called to. So we celebrate generosity. We want our clients to free up resources, not because God needs our money, but because God wants to do something through us as stewards. So, this wasn't a company that when they think about mission, they do that once a year or every few years, they bring it back out. This was something I was trained in on a regular basis, and then I saw it day in and day out. And that's really the second thing that I noticed off the bat about Blue Trust is with the firm being around for 40-something years by the time I showed up, there were advisors that I got to learn from that were 20, 30 years into this, that had sat across from clients, that had wrestled with these concepts, that had taught on them. And even Blue Trust has a SAGE program that as advisors are kind of in that final act of their career, intentionally pouring into the next generation because they're just a library of knowledge. I know some of the senior advisors in Houston that I've gotten to learn from, I'm like begging them to stay and, please don't leave and please be here when you're 80. And they love it. And they love pouring into the next generation, because if you think about a mission that you're excited about, the way that you know that you care about the mission is if you pass it on to someone else, because, it'll just live for your season of working or in existence. But if you really care about it and you really wanted to see it be accomplished, then you're going to pour into the next generation. And so there was such a focus on training the next generation, mentoring the next generation, discipling. The amount of times that I've gotten to talk to our senior advisors after a meeting or something like that and say, hey, you said this thing, or you asked the client this thing. What were you thinking, or what was coming to mind, or how would you approach this situation? And they've just been really generous with their time, which has been just really neat to see. And then the crazy thing is now I'm in the role that I'm doing that to, a younger person. And it's just made me even more excited about what we do.
Mary Helen, you have a unique role as a female advisor. I think industry-wide, it's about 16% of financial advisors are women. Blue Trust certainly has a much higher percentage. They've been very intentional to bring on women. But I'm just curious how that has been for you and any observations you have as a female advisor.
Yeah, it's so funny to me because coming from the accounting profession, by the time I was in the accounting profession, it was 50-50 women in most places. It's a more mature industry. It's been around for longer. And then my corporate accounting job, I was working for a children's hospital here in Houston. So that was pretty female heavy, even on the finance accounting department side. So it was quite a shock when I moved into financial planning. When I first started at Blue in Houston, I was the only female that was in any sort of financial planning role. We didn't have any advisors or senior advisors. So this is my joke. I've always been the highest ranking female in Houston, and that is not because I am high ranking, but there hasn't been anyone on the ground. There are incredible women, female advisors at Blue Trust across the country who have mentored me and got to know me, and I'm really thankful for that. But kind of the day in and day out mentoring is men, and I'm really blessed that there are just incredible men in my office who have cheered me on, sometimes at times a little bit faster than sometimes they believed in me and put me into opportunities maybe when I haven't felt ready. But I'm very thankful for that and for that opportunity. There are definitely moments that it's still hard, even if you have men that are incredible supporters, because at the end of the day, you're just different. Men can compartmentalize a little bit more. Maybe I ramble a little bit more. Maybe it's harder for me to kind of separate personal and professional things, or I just maybe feel out of place. I don't know a ton about sports. Right now we're working on, when guys talk about the game, is if I know if it's college or professional, which I'm like 50-50 on. And then in some senses, because the Houston office had never had a female advisor, some of our clients had never seen women give financial advice. So that was new to them, kind of to be in that role. So it's been a journey figuring that out of what that looks like. I've actually found in some senses outside of work, it's been a little bit more challenging, and just on the vulnerable side. And, I know we'll talk a little bit more about how some of my personal story has pivoted into my ministry, but, I was single when I came to Blue. And not only were all the men in advisory roles, they were all married with kids. And so, I was different because I was single. I was different because I was a woman. So it can be odd when I show up to my large Baptist church singles ministry and you say, hey, what do you do for a living? Hey, I work in financial planning. Because typically the closer you get to a Christian space, whether it's church or a ministry, the less female voices there are who even want to talk about those things, let alone put their entire, work and livelihood into those things. And so I even felt different on the personal side of just, hey, this is what I do for a living. And so it's been something that has turned in some sense into a ministry of getting to help a lot of women have confidence in this area. And then making sure also in those moments where I feel different, making sure that I don't shift into victim mentality. And I remember, hey, at the end of the day, these men, I have Christ in common. And I am a believer and they are believers. And so when we have that in common, that is the most important thing about us. And we've talked about this a lot at Blue Trust of just there's still offices where there's one female or there's not a female yet in the advisory role, even though our numbers are increasing of women in those ranks, and how it can still feel isolating. So yeah, it's just been such a unique thing because I wasn't really ready for this when I showed up because it was like I showed up and everyone was like, oh my goodness, you're a female and you're in finance. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize that was like different. And so it's just been a continual journey. And I just had to remember, as I do in all my areas of life, that sometimes God puts you at an intersection that maybe you wouldn't have put yourself in. But he puts us at intersections for a reason. And I've definitely seen that play out as I've gotten to do this job, but also do ministry outside the walls of this office. And so not to shrink, Hebrews tells us at the end of, Hebrews 10, it says not to shrink back but to take hold of our confidence. And so that's something I've learned. But yeah, that's a little bit about female advisors.
Yeah, and I'm excited to get into some of the ministry work that you do as well. Before we get there, you already mentioned that at Blue Trust, there is a broader mission than just making people richer, and generosity is a big part of that. I'd love to hear what your experience in encouraging generosity as an advisor has been like, and specifically what kind of barriers you frequently come up against and how you try to help people work through those either mental blocks or financial blocks, other kind of things that get in the way.
Yeah. So really, it always comes down to, spending or saving more. I love the book God and Money and, talking about the spenders versus the savers. And they're both trying to do the same thing, put their hope, as 1 Timothy 6 tells us, put their hope in money versus in God. But what I've seen as an advisor is that really the first thing is getting clarity on their own financial situation. So understanding with what they're doing now, where is that going to put them in 10, 20, 30 years? And so having that clarity first, and then realizing, is there even financial margin? And if there's financial margin, that's one conversation. If there's not financial margin, how do we build that in to hopefully continue the generosity that they're doing? But it's interesting when people have financial margin, sometimes we're staring at a financial plan and we can show the client, hey, the spending that you're doing, you could double it and still be fine. I love those conversations because typically, and I resonate very deeply with this because I'm a saver at heart. And spenders, it's the same thing. It just comes out a different way. But at that point, we really get to the heart issue of it. And this is where I've seen a lot of clients tear up because it's so personal. And I remember I had a client say he just pointed to his net worth. And we showed him how basically his net worth wasn't even going to be touched through the spending he was doing, because basically the income from his investments and things like that was just, going to hold it steady. And he just pointed at it and he was like, I'm so afraid of that going to zero. I'm so afraid of not having enough. I know you've shown me all the ways that I could ride through. We stress test financial plans. What if the market does this? What if, your health does this? Things like that. What if your job does this? And so we showed him, hey, you're still going to be just fine and then some. And so we just got to have this heart level conversation about what it looks like to trust the Lord. So this fear that God's not going to provide, or it's not going to look like what we think it's supposed to look like, can be that hindrance to generosity. And then on the spending side, that's where kind of lifestyle creep and trying to keep up and fear of missing out or, being looked at a certain way or things like that. Having a conversation with the client about controlling a lifestyle or shrinking it can be really tough to navigate. And I don't want to sit here and say I've gotten, that perfectly or, I have a super easy way to have that conversation, because it's not easy, because money is so tied to our heart. It's tied to so many things about us, our family, where we can go, who we hang out with, how people might perceive us. So that can be such a barrier of people think that they have to do certain things, or, maybe their kid's wedding has to look a certain way and, the financial, expense along with that. Or, if I don't go on a vacation, then, these people aren't going to want to be friends with me. So that FOMO can keep them tied up. And I think that's where, as advisors, learning to come alongside people and ask good questions. There's a mentor of mine at the firm. He always says people want to be heard and not judged. And so really, I think when I came on at Blue Trust, I had a little judgy attitude that the Lord has worked through, because when you're 26 and you start in an industry of people who are, trying to retire and things like that, you're kind of like, oh my gosh, why is this a thing that, you can't buy your BMW this year? But then you start, taking a few zeros off that expense you just looked at, and, it starts to cut into your heart, because it's not about the dollar amount. So really learning to ask questions to the client. And really the model of that is Jesus. Jesus asked more questions than he answered. I think I'm probably butchering the statistic, but I think he answered like 3 questions and asked like hundreds throughout the Gospels. Mm-hmm. And so kind of following that model, trying to get to the heart level of what's going on. And it's really interesting when you peel back that onion, why someone is, got their heart wrapped around money. And I have this same journey myself. So I'm not sitting here saying, oh, I don't have my heart wrapped around money. Everybody else does. And I just got to figure out how they get, themselves undone. But there's just some really unique, deeply personal things with clients.
Yeah, Mary Helen, I think as you were talking, I was making a connection. Even when you show someone a very conservatively built financial plan that shows you can give more, you could even spend more, I think it does take practice to unwind a lifetime of believing something and behaving in a certain way. And it's similar to if you were to read scripture and you see something in there and you go, oh, that's different than how I've been living. That doesn't mean the next day we just perfectly walk that out. It takes steps, and it takes God meeting you in those moments and teaching you, building towards changing the way that you think, letting him transform your mind. And I think as an advisor, you have that opportunity to not just show people that they're going to be okay, but even to call them out deeper and to challenge people. And that's a really exciting way to leverage the influence that God's given you as an advisor to people who trust and want your guidance and leadership. But Mary Helen, I'm also very curious to hear more about in your own life, where were you starting to apply some of these concepts that you were learning and advising around generosity? And how were you able to apply that in the communities you were becoming part of?
A big through line for me in my time at Blue has been my own singleness. I feel like if I was, and this is just how the cookie crumbled as far as the team I'm on. This is not that married people are bad. They're wonderful, incredible people. But it's just a different journey when it's just you, and all your coworkers are talking about the family camps they're going to and the ways they're intentionally pouring into their kids and, Christian private school and all these wonderful things. And I started to have this insecurity in my own financial journey of why do I have this career path that seems to be a male-dominated career path that is kind of typically the primary breadwinner, maybe a wife that's not working. And a lot of what I learned about finances growing up or kind of caught along the way was, well, you have money to provide for a family. And I just remember thinking, well, okay, now I have money. Now I have this career. And I don't have a family. So what do I do? And I felt very purposeless. And before diving into the financial side of that, I really had to learn contentment in just the stage and season of singleness that God had for me before I could even move into a more open-handed, generous space with my own finances and my singleness. I signed up for this Bible study that I still go to where they go through books of the Bible. And this was 4 or 5 years ago. And I remember saying, I want to go to this study because I want to see if marriage is promised in the Bible. Sometimes people talk about, oh, it's a psalm where it's like, delight yourself in the Lord and he'll give you the desires of your heart. And so sometimes people say, oh, if you desire marriage, just delight yourself in the Lord. He's going to give you this desire of your heart. Turns out the Bible does not promise just because you want something that you're going to get it. Even if it's a good thing, there's many people who've wanted health, who've passed away, who died of cancer early and things like that. And so I didn't find the answer I was looking for as far as, that marriage was guaranteed or promised to me. But what I did find was a good God who loves me and who has provided for me. And so I started to see in my own life, okay, God, Psalm 34 tells us that those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. If that's true, and I feel like I'm lacking because I don't have a spouse, how can I believe that that's true? And so I started to see, okay, God, you've blessed me with an incredible church community, and I have friends, and I have people to call, and yeah, I don't have a spouse, but I'm actually not alone that much. I have a lot of people, and you've given me skills and abilities and a great place to work and mentors and purpose. And because of that, I have an income. And I don't have all these responsibilities that married people have to take care of those in their household, but I'm a believer and I'm a part of the body of Christ. And I do have a responsibility there. Everybody has a responsibility in the body of Christ. It's all the one another passages in scripture. So what does that look like in my life? And for a few years, kind of wrestled through just learning true biblical contentment in singleness, which is quite hard. We don't always get fully there to contentment in this perfect state of being. But the moments that I hit it and I really was able to hit more of a stride, it was this incredible superpower. And I got to see my singleness as an asset, not only in financial generosity, but in generosity of my time. And I did a journey of generosity during that time. And the Lord just hit me so clearly. There's actually a video about a single woman physician. And she talks about God called her to work like a doctor, but live like a nurse. And I remember God saying, or actually, I don't think it was the Lord, it was the facilitator that said, Mary Helen, what if God's called you to work like a financial advisor, but live like a secretary? And, through that and through some of the reflection time, I started to realize that I had looked at financial provision as a husband. That's what I was thinking I was lacking, because I was seeing, and what was modeled to me was, oh, you go get married and that's how you get financial provision. Anyways, I feel like I'm qualifying all the things I'm saying, but, that does not mean that the husband providing for his family is bad or any of those things are wrong. But that's just, I had taken it too far. And so then I saw my singleness as, okay, God, well, you have not provided for me, so I cannot be radically generous because I have to provide for myself. This is all on me. And the Lord's just sitting there and he's like, well, I'm with you. It's like all of scripture, Psalm 23, Good Shepherd, I shall not want. And then, Jesus saying, I'm with you to the end of the age. It's just all through scripture that he's with us. But I'm sitting there in my own, situation going, you haven't provided for me. So when I started to see the Lord as my ultimate provider, and instead of my job or my abilities or potential spouse as a provider, and those are things that God might use at different times and different seasons for different people. But when I started to see that he was really the source, that's when I was able to say, okay, I'm really, really, really starting to walk out this whole God owns it all concept instead of just kind of, just hearing it and going, okay, that sounds nice. That makes sense. We're stewards, but really this is starting to come alive for me.
Yeah, Mary Helen, I just think it's so real how you're sharing. Just the journey to contentment is one that is not easy for anybody, but especially in that singleness journey, I think it can be extra hard because the church is very, very focused on families. And yet, if you look in scripture, so much of, Jesus wasn't married. He was perfect, right? And so there's so much about what each culture chooses to elevate. And I think maybe because divorce was a big deal a few decades ago and we began to match the world's statistics, they overemphasize the importance of family and marriage. But it really has been, I think, an idol in a lot of ways for the church at large, which has really alienated single people, whether you're single, never married, single again because of divorce or widowhood. It's just a really important 42 or 48% of the church is single or single again. And I just think it's a really important thing you're highlighting. And I just really admire how you've fought for contentment because that's biblical. And I think it is absolutely, no matter what God's given us, what cross we are to bear, his presence is our contentment. But it is uniquely lonely. And I would imagine it's like a double lonely, right? Because you're in an industry that's not flush with women. And then you have the singleness. So I just think it's so dignified how you're approaching it. And I really appreciate how you've shared with us.
Yeah, I appreciate y'all letting me be vulnerable. And one thing I'll say, and this is just honest, in some of that struggle, going back to being a female advisor, I really had to wrestle with, am I single because I am a female Christian financial advisor, which is a whole bunch of labels, but I'm not the typical female who's a believer. I had had some different interactions, where I had just felt like guys maybe kind of took a step back. The running joke was, you're usually cornered at a church singles event by a guy, meaning he's going to ask you out. But I kept getting cornered and guys asking me about their 401k. And so it just, I just kept having these moments where that was the lie that Satan put in my head of, you want this thing, Mary Helen, and the reason you don't have it is because this unique calling that you have. And because I didn't see a lot of women in this role, I saw a lot of men who were married very young and a lot of women who were either never married or it took them longer to get married. I was like, oh no, have I ruined my chances of getting married, which is just, I'm so thankful that God left me in that struggle, because sometimes it's so hard when God leaves you in a struggle, because he wants you to figure out in that weight room what the truth is. And you have to struggle with those heavy weights to build that faith muscle. And what I saw through that was, no, God had called me to a specific work, through what I do, financial advising. And yeah, there's not a lot of women, but so what? Why does that matter? And has nothing to do with who God might bring in my life at some point. So if there's any women listening, whatever they do, and they feel like that's maybe hindering them in their singleness, that is just not the heart of God. He loves us. He's for us. He has this incredible future for us. And it might not be what we want right when we want it or look a certain way, but we get the opportunity in singleness to see the beauty of what it looks like to follow Jesus and to have him. And in having him, we truly do have all that we need. And it's a beautiful thing and a beautiful testimony.
Well, and in the generosity conversation, people with less relational obligation, if you will, right? Like without children, without a spouse, you have so much discretionary time, discretionary money, discretionary expertise, because you're clearly investing in a career. And I think we ought celebrate that as heroes of the faith, right?
I mean, that's like what Paul was like too. Paul is the same way and maximizing every bit of that.
Yeah, there's an incredible book I always recommend to people called 7 Myths About Singleness by Sam Allberry. And it absolutely changed my view, or it really dives into 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul writes, it's better to be single. And, he wishes that all were as he were. So the tagline of the book is that marriage shows the shape of the gospel, that singleness shows the sufficiency. And so that was also another aha moment of, oh, this is not a burden. This is not meant to hold me back. This is what God has for me to propel me forward. And once I got that right, then God just started opening the floodgates. So I also have to say, be careful when you hit that moment, because God might have more for you and call you to more than you might think.
So before we get on to the kind of stewardship and ministry side of the things that you do, I just want to ask one more question on the personal journey side. You were mentioning earlier in the Journey of Generosity, the Renee Lackey video of earn like a doctor, live like a nurse. Where did that lead to in kind of your own financial life? I know she's talking kind of about finish lines basically in that video and what that looked like in her life. Where did God kind of take that in your life?
Yeah, so I think for me, that video really felt very practical in the sense of here's someone that has a similar life stage journey to me. I'm on the earlier side of my career, but I think finish lines are actually potentially even more important the earlier you are in earning and things like that. So for me, because I tend to that saver personality, I have been controlling my spending quite well. And that is not necessarily something I should be proud of, but I really haven't let lifestyle creep that much. But what I have let is savings creep, because I am the person that when extra income comes in, I think, ooh, that's going to look real nice in one of my many different savings accounts. And then I can stare at it and feel great and, put all my hope in it. But I look like a good Christian because I'm not spending it and I'm not in debt. And it's even just these sneaky ways that we can just be disobedient to the Lord. And so specifically with her, with watching that video, the Lord started calling me to give of my savings account, one of my specific savings account. And so I really set a finish line for that account. So as that account has grown, I give off of it. If I contribute to it, it's only a temporary stop because it must go out. And then my savings rate, I'm not allowed to increase that as much as I would like to. So that really was my practical implication, because and financial advisors were typically savers. And, we project out finances. And so we know if we save X amount, it's going to turn into whatever. So my savings was really what I had to guard and to really be open-handed with, because that's where I had my hands on the jump ball, so to speak, and God had to get that off.
Yeah, I am blown away at the awareness that you had, that it would have been really easy to pat yourself on the back and say, I've got my spending under control. That's where all the risk is. But you took it a step further and said, this is all God's. How am I using 100% of it, not just the piece that I'm spending? And what does that reveal about my heart and where I'm placing my security? And to put some controls around that for your own protection, but also to acknowledge God's first place in your life. I think that takes a lot of wisdom and discipline as well.
And I think one other thing I just thought of on this end is, and this is specifically for single women, a lot of times on the work side, which is what ties to our income, we go, oh, okay, I have enough for me. I'll just coast. And trust me, I wanted to, especially when COVID came around and, I was single through a pandemic. That was not fun. I was like, oh God, I'll just use all my time to find a husband. That's what I need in life. And I really just wanted to coast in my job. And the Lord said, absolutely not. You continue to use your giftings and abilities, and whatever income and career results out of that, I'm going to use. And so that's been also another way of thinking about stewardship in my singleness of, yes, it's what comes out of, once you get the income, spending, saving, giving, and taxes, all of that. But it's also, and this is almost the opposite of not setting a finish line on your career and how God might use that, because we can almost, I'm kind of mixing the metaphors now, but we can almost cap ourselves there and say, oh, well, I'll just sit in my job and, earn inflation adjusted wages. But that might be a mismanagement of stewardship. It might not. It's going to look different for every single person. But having single women, I've had a lot of this conversation of a lot of women go, oh, well, I don't necessarily know that I want to put more into my career. And it's not that we turn into workaholics or things like that, but pressing forward in that, even if you don't feel like there's a reason for the income that might result from it.
Mary Helen, I'm curious, as you set this savings finish line, I can just hear some women going, well, I could easily do that. How do you then release it to the kingdom, especially as a single person? I think for me, I was single till I was 38. It would highlight loneliness to have to give that away. Do you collaborate with other people to give that money away? Or is it easy for you because you have specific areas that you love to give to? I'm just curious what that looks like for you.
Yeah, so I don't collaborate in the sense of, I know there's giving circles and things that people do in community. I haven't found the right route for that just yet. But I think what is key is bringing a mentor or an advisor into your situation, because there is a lot of aloneness in singleness, or perceived aloneness. Mm-hmm. But 1 John 1:7 tells us, but if we walk in the light, we have fellowship with one another. And to walk in the light about anything, somebody has to know something. And so I know for me, starting to put voices around me, I had a personal mentor who knew about my financial situation, knew everything. And I remember the first time I ever told her, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the wildest thing. You know how much I make and how much I have in savings and all this stuff. And we got to talk through, because she knew specific dollar amounts. We got to talk through how to be generous. And then on the professional side, a Blue Trust, when you are an advisor, you have to have a Blue Trust advisor every year look into your financial situation, which I also think is another thing that makes us unique. And so also on the professional side, have a mentor advisor that I get to connect with regularly. And so she has a wealth of wisdom. And we've even gotten to process through what are ways that I can be, blessing and use that income and things like that. And so that's really the way that I've brought other people in. I would love to at some point do a little bit more in community, but I think right now the community that I am in is still learning a lot of these principles. So really it's kind of been through mentors and things like that.
Now, Mary Helen, I know at your church you have been very involved in using a lot of these skills that God has developed in you, a lot of your personal story, to help others, lift others up in a variety of different stages of life. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that came to be, what your involvement looks like now, and what God has been doing through that side of your life.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the mentors that I connected with at my church was connected to the stewardship ministry. And so just through learning about what God was doing in my life, really wanted me to connect. Similar to my job, the stewardship ministry was very male heavy and didn't have any single women that could speak to that demographic specifically, but it was the number one demographic that reached out. Like Julie said, whether it was single, never married, single again, widowed, they were seeing a huge increase in that. So really just jumped in. Initially, I just helped. We have a one-on-one kind of coaching offering that we do. That's really just budget coaching. We're not able to give tax advice, investment advice, as I always say, because I would get myself and the church in a lot of trouble because we are a church, not a, advisory firm. And so I got to do that. And that was really unique and exciting. And they primarily would pair me with single women. And so I started to see themes emerge. But an area that we were trying to grow was the teaching side. And so we had some different programs at the time. Our church was doing some of Dave Ramsey's stuff, some other things. A lot of it, quite frankly, and this is maybe why my story, my passion kind of shifted, is primarily it was through the marriage ministry. So they had a huge emphasis in the newlywed class, young parents. And again, all of these things are wonderful and exactly what you should be learning about at each of those stages of life. But my church in Houston also has the largest singles ministry in Houston. And Houston is the fourth largest city in America. So there's hundreds of single adults coming to church on Sunday who never got any stewardship training. I've learned to be careful about what your soapbox is because, I would show up at church and like, why is everything through the marriage ministry? And, there's all these singles that need help and, being a female and the journey of singleness for a lot of women, once they start to hit the back half of their 20s, they don't want to talk to their dad anymore. And they thought they would have a husband. And so then they're typically kind of just sitting there going, I have no idea what to do with my finances. And so if you walk around a singles ministry as a female financial advisor, people are like, I got to talk to you. I have questions. I mean, I would just be sitting on the couch after watching a movie with friends and people are telling me about their tax return. I didn't even ask, but so many single women feel so alone. And so when there's someone that they intersect with that gets it, what they're walking through, and they get the money and the faith aspect, they just vomit and they start talking. And it's one of my favorite things. And so for a year or two, was walking around the church going, we got to have something for singles. We got to have something for singles. And finally someone goes, well, hey, why don't you, tell church staff about it? Like instead of just telling all of us about it. And so got to connect with one of the staff members in the singles ministry and tell him my whole soapbox. And he goes, well, yeah, I don't know why we didn't think of this first. We just never thought about this. And I was going to initially try to train other leaders to teach people in small groups. I had this whole plan and, I was going to create a committee, like every good Baptist and just talk about it for years on end and get nothing done. And so instead he was like, instead of doing all that and love that plan, what if we just stick everyone in a room, give you a mic and just see what happens? And at this point, I was just barely starting to teach and speak in the church. And so it was very intimidating and very nerve-wracking. And the first time this very large church had ever had any sort of organized financial stewardship teaching to single adults, which is it felt like this big, weighty thing. But for 5 weeks, I got to teach and disciple about 100 single adults on all these concepts and really, in some senses, kind of blow their minds, because when I said I was going to talk about saving and investing, they thought I was going to talk about high yield savings accounts and derivatives and options and what the stock market was doing. And instead, I'm talking about avoid get rich quick and don't be in a hurry to retire and things like that. And, what if God's called you to be generous now instead of sticking it in your investment account and growing it? Because what if you're supposed to give for that kid to go to youth camp to turn into a pastor? And so it was a lot of fun. It was wild, but it was really exciting to see single adults start to take their stewardship journey seriously, because a lot of times they feel like kind of the JV team of the church, that if the church needs money, if the church needs volunteers, church needs wisdom, they're going to go look in the married ministry. But for singles to start to see that their time, their talent, their resources were valuable to the kingdom was truly one of the most exciting things I've done kind of in my post-college adult career. And that's really back to that intersection of, you don't know why you sit in an intersection, because I'd walked around and moped around the Blue Trust Houston office going, why am I the only female? Why am I the only single? And that's exactly what God had. And he needed someone at that intersection. And I taught to men and women, but a lot of times women struggled a lot more than men in this area. And so God put me at that intersection truly for such a time as this. So it's just been really fun to own that.
Yeah, I know your church has a number of different programs in stewardship, and they have a pretty cool breakdown for kind of organizing all the different resources and materials that are out there, dividing them between the financial stage of life or stage of financial health that a person or a family is going through. Maybe you can just give us a little bit of a breakdown of what that looks like for you guys.
Yeah, so our chart talks about 3 different categories: struggling, stable, and surplus. And we as a church don't want to focus on just one demographic because we have people in all of them. So the struggling is the struggling to make ends meet. And so, we call them faith centers, around the city, that it's a food pantry, it's a clothes closet. If there's financial struggle to pay bills for whatever reason, you go and meet with someone, and we pay people's electricity bills and things like that. It's not really a question of, hey, you need to control your spending to maybe get things in a good spot. And one of the things one of the demographics I've met with a lot one-on-one in the stewardship ministry at my church is single moms. And I don't know if you've ever looked at a single mom's budget with 2 or 3 kids. And, maybe they're trying to also put themselves through school to be able to have a job to support these kids. It's tough. It's, praying for the Lord to provide enough for them to have rent or something like that. And so we've got ministries like that. And then, thinking of it like a bell curve, the majority of the people are in kind of that stable of, they are able to pay bills and things like that, but there's not this huge surplus. Maybe they're young professionals just starting out their career, or in the family stage of raising kids and things like that, or maybe trying to prepare for retirement. So that's where they're in classes, like a Dave Ramsey, or we've really pivoted more to the Compass, building your finances God's way. We've really tried to focus, I say less on practical, but we really want to focus on principles. There's a phrase I've heard, behavior follows belief. So we really have wanted to teach people, what does God's word say? Because we can't, we could sit and build a great budget and a debt payoff plan, but if you don't believe that God owns it all and that he's providing, and you got to put your hope in him and not in money, then that's, a really fun chart. And so really trying to disciple people. So we have, classes that people can come no matter what demographic they're in. But then we've also, since our church is so large, so I wouldn't say I would necessarily recommend this for every church. With our church being so large, we're trying to hit demographics. So for me, I've taken a lot of the initiative with young professionals, single adults. We have members on our team focusing on the married ministry because they are married and they can give great wisdom on that, and then even, our older adults, whether they're still married or single again or never married, widowing, that kind of season. But then also the third category we have is surplus, for those that have a lot of extra. We're here in Houston and our big industries is oil and gas and healthcare. So there are executives at our church, very high income earners, business owners, things like that. We even have some like professional athletes where there's just excess. And a lot of times we forget about that demographic in our church because we just think, oh, they don't need a budget. They don't need a debt payment, snowball plan. So they're fine. But really, starting to get them connected to generous giving, going through journeys of generosity. I know the team leads of our stewardship ministry. I believe they're trying to take our whole deacon body and church leadership through journeys of generosity. So having content and resources for that demographic, even though we feel like they're fine because they have surplus. So we really want to cover the gamut because everybody struggles with money. It just, the practical implications look different. So we want to meet everyone where they're at.
Well, Mary Helen, it's been very clear that God has designed a path for you and through some twists and turns brought you into a really beautiful expression of not only generosity in your own life, but inviting and sharing that with others. What are you most excited about when you think about the next 5 to 10 years?
I love this question because I am weirdly excited and optimistic about the future. I feel like sometimes there's just sentiment that, oh my gosh, everything is, nothing to be excited about with the future. But I think for me, kind of tying back to what I've seen in the church and financial stewardship, I'm seeing that we're not quite there, but money is becoming less of a taboo topic at church. We'll talk about a lot of very vulnerable things in the church that we never used to talk about, divorce, sexual abuse, things like that. Money is still, we don't go to our small group and say, you know what I really struggled with this week? Greed and contentment. I am just not content in my finances. We still are not quite there, but that engine is starting to churn and it's heading in that direction because what excites me about teaching singles and especially young singles is that seed that's planted when they're 20, 25, 30. What is that going to turn into in 20 years? And how are they going to carry it into whatever God has ahead of them? Because pairing that with both the wealth transfer and the wealth creation that's happening, because some of these 25 and 30-year-olds are going to inherit money, and some of them, and or both, are going to be wealth creators and create a lot of money, because we are in a very wealthy age and era. And so you pair those two things together. If we start really talking about money in church, and I mean really, not, I probably should stop spending, but talking about greed, talking about where our contentment lies, talking about those struggles, I think that's where Satan has had a hold on money in America, is because we don't want to talk about it. In some senses, we don't have to talk to everyone about it. But what's kept in the dark grows on us. The fear grows, the greed grows. That's 1 John 1:7, as I said, walking in the light. Then we have fellowship with one another. And then we can do something about it. So I just think the braver we are, whether we're in the seat of, leading in a financial stewardship ministry and teaching on these subjects, or we're just a lay person championing these things. You don't have to be someone who's the one on the front lines teaching or things like that, but maybe you're just the cheerleader for the financial stewardship ministry in your church and you want to help whoever it is facilitate those things. So I'm just excited to see where that goes because those seeds are there and they're all under the ground right now. But when they start popping up, I just think there's going to be some really cool things.
Yep, I agree 100%. And we are seeing that all the time, all over the place. So very excited to see what God has in store. As we get to the end of the episode, we like to end everyone with just a practical action our listeners can take to step into their role as stewards and manage God's wealth wisely. So, Mary Helen, do you have a suggestion for our listeners today?
Having an eye for those in your world. And so one thing for me in my world is I have some friends that are in ministry, not here locally. So using my money to go visit them, even the blessing of my presence, and it costs money and things like that, and costs time also to connect with them because those in ministry, maybe they don't have the resources to travel. I mean, I have friends that work in ministry that they don't have gas money, to go anywhere but, to their local church and back home. So, going to visit them and to bless them and encourage them because ministry is not easy. And so that's one thing that I've done in my own life. And, Julie, even talking about how in singleness we have this kind of extra time and margin and capacity to maybe show up in those ways because we don't have those family responsibilities, and things like that. I've also seen single women or single adults in general. I've seen them pay for tuition for nieces and nephews in their world. And I've seen them house ministries that are back on furlough. One of the things I also love about my church is we have a missionary care department, caring for not only missionaries that we support, but in general. And so a lot of those missionaries, as they come back stateside to fundraise or to be on furlough for whatever reason, opening up the extra room in your house for a missionary to stay with. The number one demographic of missionaries is also single women, which is exciting. And so, just having that special eye for people in your community that you can step in a unique way. So those are kind of two things that I would say on that end.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I love the focus on really just channeling everything about where God has you and what he's equipped you with in whatever stage of life you're in, and using all of that to amplify his kingdom and be a part of it to whatever degree he invites you in. And you have clearly done that in your own life and are equipping so many others to do that as well. So thanks for sharing your story with us today, Mary Helen. This has been a lot of fun and so many good takeaways from this. Just appreciate what you're doing and appreciate you being with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a really good time.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show, guys. If you want to find any references or links from today's show, you can always find them in our show notes at finishlinepledge.com/episode 136. Before we finish up, I have a quick question for you. Have you ever stopped to answer the question, how much is enough? A financial finish line is designed to help you do just that. Our 90-day Finish Line Pledge breaks down the process into 3 easy steps. Step 1, define how much is enough for you and your family to spend in a single month and use that as your monthly spending budget for 90 days. Step 2, as God provides money to manage, set aside any margin outside of your finish line into a separate bank account. Step 3, after 90 days, explore the many ways you can use the margin you've set aside to create joy, purpose, and impact in God's kingdom. Want to learn more? Check out our website at finishlinepledge.com. That's all we have for today. We'll see you next time.